So after 5 extremely tough years for the world economy, the latest IMF forecast shows growth increasing. How come?
Well, probably because the global economy is finally turning the corner of the crisis that we've had. And you are right. We had 3% growth last year. We are forecasting 3.6 this year and 3.9 next year. So it is progress.
Right.
It's not yet at full potential and certainly not enough in some regions of the world to absorb the unemployment that we have in many, many corners. But it is growth and it is recovery underway.
And so what are the keys to getting growth back up to where it could be and should be?
You know, one thing we learned from the crisis is that it cannot be a one-size-fits-all. There was very much the impetus for stimulus at the time of the crisis, which had its benefits but also some downsides. What we're learning now is that it has to be region and sometimes country-specific, depending on the development of the economy and depending on the structure of the economy and the demographics as well.
Right.
So I would say that what is probably a common factor to all economies is the need for structural reforms. This is something that the United States can afford. This is certainly something that the Europeans can do. And it is also something that some of the developing countries and emerging markets can embark upon. That's a common factor. Then you have the issue of monetary policy, which we believe has to remain supportive in the European region, in Japan, and which is now gradually under a tapering and one of these days, not too soon, tightening process in the US. Right. And from a fiscal point of view, again, the solution will vary depending on the state of the economy. We believe that at the moment, the fiscal consolidation that is progressing is doing so at the right pace. Right. Not too much of it. There has been a lot of fiscal consolidation during the austerity years, so to speak, and now is the time to slow down a bit and let growth pick up.
You talk about structural reforms, which are so important everywhere. They're also among the most difficult reforms to enact. With the crisis now behind us, doesn't it get much more difficult without that incentive to enact them?
You're absolutely right. You shouldn't let a crisis go to waste or something along those lines. And a crisis is a strong change agent because there are no options available. Right. Whereas now that growth is picking up, the tendency will be to slow down a bit, eventually go back to business as usual, relax. And now is not really the time to do so because there is still a lot of work that is either unfinished or that has not yet started. In the unfinished jobs, I would include the financial sector, discipline and supervision. I'm not using the word regulation on purpose because I believe that a lot has been done on that front. And it's more a question of implementing, measuring the consequences and unintended consequences of it, and strengthening the supervision.
The region that seems to have the lowest forecast growth is Europe. And it's very low, even though it's better than recession, but what's going to be the key to getting that eventually back up to sort of normal growth levels, and how long might that take?
In the euro area in particular, we believe that the European Central Bank can continue to provide enough monetary easing to, number one, provide enough liquidity to the financial sector, and number two, facilitate the credit creation, particularly to the benefit of small and medium-sized enterprises. The fragmentation of the banking sector in the Eurozone has reduced, but is still there and needs to be addressed. That's one thing. The second thing that Euro area countries and the Euro area in general should continue doing is structural reforms. We have seen some of it in Spain, in Italy, in countries that were or are under program, like Ireland, Portugal, Greece. They have to keep at it. That's the it's fortunate or unfortunate, but it's a fact that the rigidities embedded in those economies have to be constantly removed, ironed out, so that people can actually give their full potential. It's the case as well in a country like France or Germany. There are still reforms to be done.
Much in the news, of course, is Ukraine and the new program there. In the larger picture there, I'm hearing reports that the sanctions on Russia are leading banks, Western banks, to stop or restrict credit to Russia and other CIS customers, and that this may harm the economic prospects not only in Eastern Europe, but potentially even Western Europe. How great a threat is this?
Well, on the whole chapter of sanctions, I think one should observe that the threat of sanctions has already had consequences and produced effects. You can see that in the capital flow movement out of Russia into other places. You will probably see foreign direct investment numbers down significantly in Russia. The forecast for growth by the Russian authorities themselves has been significantly lowered. We have revised ours to close to nothing this year, and 1% next year, assuming the geopolitical situation is settled, which is a big assumption. And then the sequence 1, sequence 2 of the sanctions is, showing what the intentions are. And clearly, there are private sector actors that are also drawing lessons from the uncertainty and the unpredictability arising from the disorder in between Russia and Ukraine. So it's not surprising that banks would be pulling out or removing some of the capitals that they had invested, or restricting or reducing the activity that they have in Russia.
What's the threat of a potentially larger crisis? People think of the late 90s when many people said, well, problems in Thailand, how could that possibly be significant? Well, it became highly significant. Could something like that happen here?
I think you always have the risk of one particular nucleus of a crisis would expand beyond that country. I remember back in the days when the euro area crisis started, we all thought, well, Greece is not such a large member of the eurozone, and the matter could probably be settled given the size of the Greek GDP relative to the rest of the zone. Well, little did we anticipate at the time that it would spread out and constitute what was then described as a systemic risk. So, yes, all that can happen. But I believe that we today have a better understanding of the interconnectedness, whether through trade, through foreign direct investment, and more importantly, through financial channels. Now, there is one additional interconnection, if you will, that is present in the Ukraine case, which did not exist in the Greek case, for instance, or not in the Thai case, to my knowledge, and that's the energy factor. Because Ukraine is a transit country through which a lot of gas, for instance, is channeled from Russia to other European countries. And the alternatives further south are not yet available. The LNG terminals are not yet built, and there is that degree of uncertainty which clearly could cause problems going forward.
Income inequality is a very hot topic these days, and the IMF has done some research on it, finding that inequality and low growth are associated with one another. But which causes which?
The IMF has always been interested in that matter, and I think we have always paid attention to the risk that inequality bears on the macroeconomic and other policies. So it's not as if it was the latest trendy matter to look at. We've always looked at it, and I spoke about it over a year ago because we saw and still see today worryingly increasing trends of inequality, which we believe has consequences on the macroeconomy and other policies. So it is trendy at the moment because quite a few people have written about it. But we have been concerned about it. And we've been concerned for two reasons. One is we believe that it tends to increase the financial risks if you have too much disparity between income distribution. And based on the research that we've done, we see that rising inequality is not supportive of sustainable growth. To the extent that growth is part of our mandate and critical for stability in the world, we believe that inequality needs to be looked at. There are countries that are showing very strong signs of rising inequality, and that is the case in the US as well.
And what's the policy prescription?
It has to be, again, country-specific. What works in some European countries that have been used to much larger tax burden will not necessarily work in the United States. But generally speaking, fiscal policies are useful tools. My own belief is that the first way to deal with inequality is to make sure that everybody has a job. Right. So, you start with that one. Second, you make sure that public spending is focused on those policies that will reduce inequality, such as good health services for all, including the poorest, access to education, including to those who are not well off or blessed by fortune. And then you have the redistributive policies that can be applied, provided they're well calibrated, provided they're not excessive, because if you set marginal rates that are too high, they are clearly disincentives to perform and to create growth.
China is one of the drivers of the world economy, I guess the largest contributor to global growth among any country. What are the main worries, the main threats to this continued growth, which is so important to the world's growth?
Again, it's twofold. One, it's a country that is clearly strongly interconnected with the rest of the world, particularly from a trade perspective. Yeah. The key engine for growth of the Chinese economy for many years was export. Now, clearly how the rest of the world is doing matters for China enormously, because it determines how much they export. But there are now domestic factors that are weighing heavily on the growth model of China as well. And how controlled that will be, how the monetary policy will be designed in order to create the volume and degree of liquidity, for instance, in the Chinese economy, without creating bubble, without exposing the country to major financial risks. The way in which internal consumption, domestic consumption, if you will pick up the baton from export, how the China economy will continue to rebalance as it has, because the current account has significantly reduced over the last 3 years, how it will internationalize its currency and open its capital account so that investment in China are free in all sectors. All of those questions, to me, are fascinating because they will be addressed by the Chinese authorities in a probably fairly controlled way, using pilot cases such as the Shanghai zone, for instance, to see how it works.
Right. I want to turn to technology a little bit. Technological unemployment has been a worry for 200 years. It hasn't happened. Now, some economists are worried that maybe it's going to happen. What's your view?
I find that a fascinating debate. My mother was born in Lyon. And Lyon, of all places, was the industrial town of France, where the canut, the people who were weaving those beautiful textiles, threw away in the river all the mechanical weaving machine and machineries because they thought that they would go unemployed. Well, that hasn't happened, as you said. In the last 200 years, there has been a fear that it would happen. And jobs disappeared, but were replaced by new jobs. Now, whether or not the intelligence attributed to robots will in fact destroy jobs without recreating new jobs is something that we will see in the next 10, 15, 20 years, which will be a very exciting development. I think that you will continue to need people to build those robots and to feed them with the artificial brain that they don't have. I believe that new fields of economic development that we today maybe call cultural fields will be created over the course of the next decades, and that will be a fascinating development. I strongly believe that progress actually will continue to create those jobs.
And what about the role of technology in the development of the low-income economies in particular? There would seem to be a real opportunity for changing the paradigm of growth on that basis. What do you think?
Well, it does, not in all places, but there are network developments that we're seeing at play. For instance, in some African countries, with the use of mobile telephone as a device not to talk to each other, not to send text to each other, but to share information, to move money around, to cut out the intermediaries, and to make sure that money goes where it should, to make sure that the weather forecast is going to be received by the farmers so that they can actually plan and anticipate. So that's one of those developments where technology is actually breaking through old-fashioned and sometimes very heavy-loaded networks of rent seekers.
Right. An opportunity to cut through that.
Yeah.
There's a topic that few people want to talk about, which is corruption. But it's a significant economic problem in many countries. It's been a problem well known in Ukraine for what's in the news, but in many other countries as well. Xi Jinping is campaigning against it in China. Do you see much progress in other countries? It's very, very difficult to do anything about.
Yes, that's correct. It is difficult. And, for having been finance minister of France during the crisis and having endorsed, together with others, the fight against tax havens, for instance, which are nice areas in which to park corrupted money or to do money laundering, it is a very difficult task because there are lots of dark interests out there that have zero interest in progressing this issue. But it's also a fact, and I think the economic literature is unambiguous about it, that it is a major brake on economic development, and it's a very regressive factor.
Yeah. You have talked also about the possibility, the danger of a low-growth trap that the developed economies could find themselves in. Could you explain what that is and what the danger is?
The secular stagflation type of approach to life. We believe that if the right policies are adopted, if there is enough and early enough a concern about deflation or the risk of low inflation, for instance, if the structural reforms that are badly needed in some of those advanced economies in particular are implemented, and if they are inclusive methods to develop growth, meaning giving access to women, for instance, to the workforce in some countries, facilitating immigration, improving education, that fear of secular stagflation should be set aside.
Right. Despite your own success as a global leader, you have said that the glass ceiling still exists. Why does it persist?
I think the glass ceiling still exists. You just look at the numbers and see, how women are for equal work in many countries of the world, how little access many of them have to the capital market, to credit when they want to start a business, to land ownership in some countries, to education in other countries. So that glass ceiling is unfortunately a kaleidoscope across the world, and not one-faceted as we tend to look at it from an advanced economy point of view. Right. So when I talk about the glass ceiling, I think about that kaleidoscope, which applies in Afghanistan, which applies in the Emirates and in Saudi and in African countries and in Germany and in Japan and in the US. It's multifaceted, and it is still there. And it's a factor of culture, it's a factor of minority versus majority, and it's our internal factor, as has been described in a few books lately.
Right. Do you think there's a so-called glass cliff? Women in leadership positions are often in risky or precarious positions.
Yeah, I think that is the case. There was a recent study conducted about the stronger likelihood of a woman CEO being fired than the likelihood of a man CEO being fired.
Right. Culturally, politically, is America or France ready for a woman president?
Time will tell. But there are lots of very competent women around.
Just a couple of things to close. One, who is a leader you admire?
I think the current Pope has many of the attributes of a leader that I'm prepared to admire. I find, people from our past to have been great leaders. I think General de Gaulle was an amazing leader in the face of adversity and with little support. I think that Churchill was an incredible leader in his own right, in times of adversity more so than in sort of peaceful time. I think Gandhi was an extraordinary leader, using alternative tools. I think Mandela was an amazing leader as well. There are lots and lots of them. Yeah. I'm afraid there are many men in that group. So.
What inspires you to do what you do?
Two things. One is the thought that by us at the IMF doing a good job, providing the right analysis and being honest in our relationship with authorities, we hope to improve the life of the little kids in Niger, in Mali, in Cambodia, in many places around the world where the economic development has not yet risen the standard of living to allow them to have number one, enough on the table every day, and number two, education as they should have it. And the second thing is the group of very talented people who are driven by that same sort of mission spirit in the institution.